Now that we've multi-processed image 6502 three different ways, we've got everything in Photoshop, we're ready to begin the blending process. I want to start by renaming things to make it clear what's what. If we double click on the first layer, let's call this sky, because it's obviously the darker sky image. The next one is some version of the ground, but I need to zoom in and just toggle the layers to see that the middle one is the one with detail. This had 10 points of noise reduction, and the bottom one is going to be the noise reduced version that had 40 points of noise reduction. So I just want to label what's what so I don't get confused as I work on these. Now that I've got that labeled, we'll click on pre-blend, and as usual, sort dark on top, add black mass, and click to blend layers. And everything at this point is in a reasonable order. However, I would prefer to start with no noise and then add in detail where I need it. So I'm going to reverse the order of these bottom two layers. An easy way to do that is just click and drag the layer down, then you can click and drag the mask up, and that's it. Now you've resorted them in the order you need them. So to begin, I'm going to blend in this area of detail where I want it, which is on the tree and the rocks, but it's not on this mid-ground where there's a lot of noise showing. One way we can do that is to freehand paint with a brush. Another way is to use something like a quick select. So I'll hit W for quick select, and now we can select the foreground areas where we want to target, and that will help more easily quickly paint where we want things. Obviously I've over selected with the midground, but I can hold down the Alt key now and subtract out those areas, and usually quick select will do a pretty good job of tidying things up when you have a clean edge like this. These rocks here got missed, so I'm going to shift select them to fill that out, and so now I've got a pretty good discrimination. I'm not worried about being overly precise with these because as I'm painting in the detail, it's a very subtle thing. You have to look closely to see the difference, and I'm going to use a large soft brush. So in general, don't overthink what's going on at this stage. It's just a subtle way to add a little more detail. Hitting B for my brush, selecting this mask, and Command H to hide my marching ants. And let's just check that I've got a good soft brush. I think that looks good. We can kick at the flow a little bit to maybe 4. And now I'm just going to start painting in this tree, which is a little more precise, and along these edges. And then just paint with a larger brush down below to fill in the detail. Alt clicking on my mask, I can see where things are now. And I'm just going to quickly fill in these areas here. And again, don't be overly worried. You're not going to have a harsh area of noise suddenly appearing in your image. This is not fully white. It's a little softer than it may appear. And so things are not quite as dramatic as they might seem at this stage. Let's now zoom in and take a look at what we have here. So from before to after, I'm not seeing any noise appear in the sky image. So we look at some areas of detail like this. I could do a little bit more, so just grabbing the brush and painting right over that. Before and after is a little more detail. So I think along this ridge line I could do a little bit more. Let's Alt click this mask, and I need to get things a little closer to white along that ridge line in order for that detail to show up. Okay, and I think that should do it. Let's zoom in to just confirm. But as we move around the image here, looking from before to after, notice that extra detail showing through the wood. It's subtle, but it does add a nice touch, and here it's adding a lot more detail. So it's just giving us an ability to get the best of both worlds. A little bit of detail from one layer and some noise suppression on the other layer, so we don't have all that nasty noise in the background. If we had just the 10 points of noise reduction, we'd be looking at this, which just really doesn't look very nice. So I think this is a much better job of sort of blending the two together. So at this point, let's hit Command D to deselect. We now need a selection to start painting on the next layer. If we take a look at Lights 2 as the basis for blending in the sky, it does a good job of picking up the sky, but too much of this tree. Clicking on Lights 3 does not pick up the tree, but it's getting a little dark in the sky. So either one could be modified by clicking on the Levels layer. But another approach to this would be to change the basis of how the preview is generated. Right now it's based on the underlying layers because that's all that's visible. If we shift click on the mask for our dark sky image, now that becomes the basis for the masking because that's what's showing underneath here now that we've hidden that mask. And so with this now being the basis of that mask, we can take a look at Lights 2, and that creates a nice separation between the sky and the tree. I'd like to use that as my selection. Whether you use the darker exposure or the lighter exposure really depends on the image, but sometimes the darker exposure has a little bit more contrast and can give you a better result. So I generally like to take a look at both before I determine which one I want to use. Sometimes one just makes your life a lot easier than the other, especially if you've pushed shadows on one layer or something like that that might reduce contrast in one version of the image. So let's click on cell to load it as a selection. Click on the mask to get the black mask visible. B for the brush, X to white paint. Zooming back a bit here, and I'm going to kick up my flow. I can work a little more quickly. And now just start brushing through this sky. And there was good separation between the sky and the tree, so I'm not overly worried about painting across it. And go pretty quick. And once we've got a baseline across this image, we can go to a split screen version. So we'll click on split to see the side by side. I'm going to hit Command minus to zoom back and just slide this up so I get a better view of my mask up top, and then click split so I see the two side by side. Now I can continue brushing right over it to continue painting things in. Mostly what I'm worried about here is the transition areas around the tree and around the foreground, the horizon line there. So I want to make sure those get really good, and the rest we can quickly fill in since there's nothing critical beyond these boundaries, and it's very easy to fill in white in those other areas, just like we've done in the past. Some of these areas here, the clouds were pretty dark, so the selection is pretty weak, and I need to make multiple passes in order to lighten things up. Just looking to make sure that things near the horizon are in pretty good shape, and things around the tree. Once we get that good, we'll switch over to using dodge to fill in the rest of this image. So if I just push things to a middle gray value, that's all I need for the dodge tool to be able to do its work and finish out the image here. So again, some of the tedious work here, just filling things out, but you gotta do it. It's really starting to come through pretty good in a lot of areas here. So at this point, let's go ahead and switch to the dodge tool to move a little faster. I'm going to hit Command D to deselect. Switching to basics, click on the triple pluses for the dodge tool, or just load it here. It's a lollipop looking icon that can be hiding under the burner or sponge tool. With that set to target the highlights and exposure around 4% is fine. Now, as you paint with it, it's going to take things that are lighter and push them towards white. So it's going to save it. It's going to avoid making any changes to areas that are black in the mask, but then take the other gray pixels and push them towards white. So it's a quick way to work around these edges and lighten things up. What you don't want to do though is paint repeatedly over edges, because it will start to take the soft transition you have and push it towards a hard mask. So you still don't want to be just painting crazy over the edges. You will start to cause problems in your mask if you do that. But as long as you stay safely back from the edges or just occasionally brush over them, it's going to look just fine. And I just like how quickly you can work with this tool to really kind of refine things, get a nice soft result. And I'm just watching below as I'm painting here, looking to see the contrast improve as I move over the image. And you see the image getting progressively darker in these areas as I work over them. And looking at the mask, just looking for any areas that look like they're obviously kind of underpainted or too gray that I may want to fill in without getting too dangerously close to the edges or pushing things too far in some of those critical areas, because I do want to make sure I retain that soft transition. And now just going over these edges, make sure I get rid of those little halo effects. And at this point, that should be a pretty clean blend. So I'm going to switch to the brush, hit Command-Shift-D to reload my selection. You can see it's active here, and just quickly go over this tree one last time, make sure that's good. Close this, let's zoom in and see what we're dealing with. At this point, the tree details are, for the most part, looking pretty good. With the exception of right here, I think we need a little bit more blending. If we shift-click on our darker sky exposure, you can see that darkening them down is going to look better. They look a little bit sort of pasty or ghosted here. So hit Command D to deselect. Let's go click on just a regular light selection, and I think that should be just fine to target these brighter edges. Click on cell to load that as a selection. all we're trying to do here is simply bias it towards the brighter edges. We don't have to get overly precise. There's not much detail to protect. So you could almost freehand these edges here and get a good result, but having a little protection with the luminosity selection is a smart thing just to make sure you're not losing detail. And just brushing over these areas a couple of times in each spot to bring out that detail. You can see it just nicely comes through, looks a little bit better. I don't like them having too ghosted. They get a little bit ghosted. Even the original, if we shift click this layer, they're a little bit ghosty. I mean, this doesn't actually get any darker than that one is there. That's all the layer has. So if you want to change that, you'd have to reprocess the raw. But just take a look at what we can do here. If we shift click this again, a little bit right here, and see if we can't get this in a little bit better. There we go. I think that looks good. There is a little bit of haloing here. There's a little bit of haloing here. It's pretty subtle. So we should go ahead and darken that down. To do that, let's deselect. Let's click on lights to see how that looks. If we look at the darker layer, that's got a good bias towards the highlight. If we click on lights 2, that's a little too much. So clicking on lights, and then let's just bring in the black point a bit here. Not too much, just enough to kind of bias things. There we go, that looks good. Right around 21 there. Click on cell to load that as a selection. Hitting B for our brush, bringing the flow way back down here. A little bit larger brush and zoom back just to see the bigger picture. And re-enable our layer. So with white paint now across our new luminosity selection, going to darken down this area just a little bit, just enough around these edges here to try to avoid it from looking haloed. Darken that a little bit. And may just darken this top area a little bit to match. And zooming in here, this also has a bit of a halo, so let's zoom in the smaller brush and just hit those edges more carefully. And right there, I think that's already done it. Zooming back, hit them a little bit more, and the rest of this is mostly just good separation, so wouldn't take out too much of that. And just looking at the big picture, I think we've got the overall blend looking really good, and we can move on to the next steps.